welcome everybody to our new session where we're talking about the role of the media in conflict. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Okay, I'll ask them to put the mic on. Yeah. Can you hear me now, yeah? You can't hear me? Can you hear me?
Should be good. I think channel 11, I think, would be. It should be.
Can
If it's not working properly, channel 11.
you hear me? Yeah, can you hear me now, yeah? Great, great. Sorry about the technical hiccup, but welcome all of you to this session on freedom of media in conflict zones, international reflections on access and safety in conflict zones. This is quite a pertinent conversation that we're having this afternoon here as part of the Paris Peace Conference. I want to put a few statistics in front of you so that you understand why we're having this session this afternoon. According to the Committee to Protect Journalists, alone between the last decade or so, 839 journalists themselves have been killed on the front line in various conflict zones. So it's a real credit to our friends at the European Union of the Foreign Policy Instrument under Dr. Peter Wagner to decide to hold this important session today. So I'd like to introduce you to our panelists. As I call your name, please come and join me on the podium, and then we're going to start with a short video and then a conversation. So first I'll call Alexandra Mishukov. She's the Ukrainian human rights lawyer. Annette Faber, the EU envoy to the Horn of Africa. Ben Solomon, filmmaker and journalist with a Pulitzer Prize and Emmy Award. And then Shada Hashimi, founder and general director of Aid, Humanitarian and Journalism. Unfortunately, our friend from Sudan is unable to join us, which is a shame, but we have other people who can speak to Sudan. Thank you. Great. So good afternoon, all of you. I started by, citing the figures, very terrible figures that are facing journalists today, 839 between 2014 and 2024. And Ben, I wanted to start with you because the big challenge today that we see is that journalists are now increasingly targeted by military actors, by paramilitary forces, by all various actors, and increasingly not just these groups, but by political groups as well. So we've seen key political figures arresting, kidnapping, holding at ransom, and stopping you from doing your work. And just looking at the sheer scales of your colleagues that have been killed on the front line is increasingly, I was saying in our briefing session that journalists too are an increasing endangered species as well. So I wanted to ask you, in this situation, Ben, where all sides are controlling your access, how are you able to do your work? How are you able to gain objectivity? How are you able to be the first line of defending what is really important in journalism, which is the truth as well? How are you able to do it? You've got vast experiences in a number of places, and I'd like to start off with you. Thank you.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, it's no secret that it's a difficult time to be a journalist right now. I think over the past 10 years since I've started my career, 15, it's been getting more and more complicated, both politically, but also in terms of security, in terms of reporting on conflict. Something that Annette and I were discussing before this is the real one silver lining, the benefit, is the empowerment of local journalists. It is a shame that our colleague Zainab can't be here with us because she is one of the most prolific and important reporters in Sudan right now. it's hard to work in these places and try to navigate truth and try to be able to get through the noise, the propaganda, the limitations. But working with local journalists like Zainab in Sudan, I've worked for the past few years in Ukraine, working with so many of the local journalists there and utilizing their experience and appreciating and empowering their ability to stay true to the facts, even when may not be the most comfortable for your own nation state, for your own kind of the story that maybe the government wants to put out, is really the best way that I found in utilizing the ability of local producers to tell the stories in important ways. It's been complicated in so many conflicts. The power of the cell phone to tell your own story it is good and bad, right? Like it's got the ability to empower people to get stories out there. We see it in Gaza all the time. So many amazing voices on the ground that we're able to follow and see and track. But it's also important to work with people and to understand the limits, not only for our own selves, as for myself as an international journalist, but our abilities to empower those people, give them the space and the ability to tell their stories in ways that are important to the conversation, truthful, and help kind of push each conversation forward in each one of these conflicts. So it's tough, but there's also some small bits of positive and progress that I've been seeing over the past 10 years.
Yeah. Ben, Ineta, I saw your hand trigger then. I know that you want to ask a question yourself and comment, but Ben, one question I wanted to ask you, because you rightly put a spotlight on the difficulties that face local journalists as well, and it's a shame that Zainab is not here. What do you think would be the crucial elements that we can sort of advocate for, put on the table to better protect local journalists who are crucial and in a sense are the first line of defense to gather that information? How can we better protect local journalists like Zainab and others that you and everybody on the panel has worked with?
Money,
Right.
more funding. Mm-hmm. I think in my industry I've seen for a long time the reasoning for utilizing local journalists is that they're cheaper. For a lot of newsrooms, it's easy for newsrooms to kind of say, okay, well, this is more affordable, this is more easy, we don't have to pay them as much, it's from a different country. It's a problem. We should have an equal funding for someone that is an international journalist as well as somebody that's a local journalist. Like, there should be a steady way to pay people the correct amount, an amount that allows them to live their lives, to make a living, and have an equitable way for all these journalists to come to the table. I think a great start is being able to just give the funding needed to help local journalists do the work. I cannot work in Sudan without a local journalist. I can't work in Ukraine without a local journalist. You need these people to utilize their expertise, to utilize their abilities, to utilize language, and they should be paid fairly. So the best and easiest way forward is to, pay them more and correctly.
Annette, I saw your finger move there, so I assumed you wanted to react to what Ben was saying. I mean, I have a separate question that I want to ask you later, but being that Ben referenced Sudan and you are the EU envoy for the Horn and a great deal of your time is spent on Sudan, I wanted to get your reactions also to what Ben was saying, and you particularly know Zainab, so you'll have a view on the kind of work and the difficulties and the risks that local journalists like Zainab face in their work.
Thank you. Maybe 2 points on this, because if we look back at the first war in Darfur, we basically didn't have the opportunity to hear the voices from Darfur in the same way we hear Sudanese voices right now as local journalists. And I think that change, that difference is tremendous, and it's hugely important. Your question on how to protect them, as a mediator, as someone who is talking to the belligerents on a very regular basis, to me it's also important not just to use that, the sentence of saying we see what you're doing and we follow your atrocities, but also to make it possible that these atrocities are documented. Documentation right now of course, it's not the work of journalists alone, but no one from outside can document at the moment what's happening in Sudan. That has been different before. It was difficult, but it was possible. Right now, it's not possible. If we want to build pressure on the belligerents to say there is accountability, even if you don't feel it now, there will be accountability, we need to have the facts. And I think something Ben was alluding to, the story that actors want to hear. I think we have a very clear understanding of the different narratives of the two sides, what they want to be seen as, how they want to be reflected. Of course, they're also using journalists, but I think this brings this problematic new. It's not new. It's been an old question, but the problem is, how do you verify all of what is coming out of Sudan? How do you verify what is a narrative sponsored by one side and what is the truth? We spoke about truth before, and I think this is really a very difficult issue that needs more attention.
Even Annette, I'm going to ask you to keep the microphone. Even more so where access is restricted, where you can't move around freely in any given country. You've put a spotlight on Sudan. I know Alexander and Shada will talk about their experiences in Ukraine and Yemen and elsewhere. But what do you do where increasingly the governments who you engage are restricting the movements of journalists, both international and international, when they're not able to talk to both sides in the conflict, so you may end up seeing only one side of the conflict? And how does that also compromise, make difficult your work as a mediator? And I've thrown a number of questions to you, Annette, but the question is, how do you do your work when the very key actors that are crucial to that do not have the kind of access that you need to be able to put a spotlight on any given conflict? It can be Sudan, it can be Ethiopia, it can be Somalia. You are the Horn Envoy for an entire region. Mm-hmm.
And I think the three examples you gave, the biggest war we've seen before the war in Sudan started was, of course, northern Ethiopia. Did we have any pictures, any reporting from inside? Hardly anything. And I think
this is the Tigray,
War, the northern Ethiopian war. And I think this is something we need to bring it more into the conversation and the pressure points in the conversation with the belligerents and with the states and with the governance, with the government, because to me the question is not just protection of humanitarian aid workers and protection of civilians. That of course is the big issue. We need to have more pressure on access for independent journalists, but also security for national journalists, for journalists on the ground. How do you get this if there is no structure that can provide any security? I mean, you've been to Khartoum, to Omdurman. You can only go to one side, as you said. I mean, you need to have that network of local people, activists, journalists everywhere. You need to have a lot of knowledge on the situation from before to be able to verify what is coming out and it has, makes sense and what doesn't make sense. And this is becoming, of course, increasingly problematic. If the war continues, it's going to be almost impossible to follow that logic. So we are then, just hoping that there is truth in what we hear, but we cannot verify. And I think this is becoming a huge issue on the accountability question later on. But of course, in the mediation, if the two parties want us to understand that there's only atrocities done by the other side, and they bring their own journalists, they bring their own facts, they bring their own narrative, their own stories, to exemplify that they are basically innocent and the atrocities are done by the other side. This, of course, will have a huge negative influx on mediation.
And let me just push you a little bit further. How do you deal with disinformation in your work as a mediator when you're trying to corral all the different actors, bring them to the table? How do you manage the disinformation and efforts also to discredit the work that you're trying to trying to do when you're in the process of mediation. There's a key issue about transparency, and the assumption is that journalists, civil society, in all their different guises, activists are crucial to helping you verify, fact check, and obviously you have your own system of fact checking as Envoy as well. But how do you manage all of that in a very, very noisy space when everybody is trying to generate their own ground truth and say this is the truth versus the fake news that we're seeing?
It's not possible to only do mediation. In the case of Sudan, I think only focusing on the belligerents is the wrong approach, because then you only get their narratives. You need to engage constantly with as broad as possible, civil society, journalists, different people, different backgrounds, not just from the center, from various regions. That doesn't mean we have the truth, but we have a multitude of angles that then makes it easier to understand where, are we getting close to something we can call the truth. I think only focusing on the belligerents would put us into a rabbit hole of one side, the other side, and without having the focus of the people and basically the different regions, the different actors who are not just who are not just the victims of the war, but who in their own engagements, of course, are also party to these narratives. As much, as many information as you can get, and as deep as you can get into these narratives and into the different angles, I think helps you or helps me also pulling the bluff. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Sorry,
go ahead.
I think the old adage that is always important and I've always followed is the most important war stories never happen on the front lines.
Yeah.
It's the stories of the people that are suffering, the human stories that connect viewers, readers, people that I'm trying to connect and show stories to with people on the ground are always the most important and powerful. So it's a really important point.
Well, that's an important segue to ask Shada, because the work that your organization is doing is precisely this. And you said, when we were having our introduction earlier on, that you were born in a war zone, in a conflict zone, and the organization works throughout a number of important countries, Yemen, Iran, Iraq, in the Sahel region as well. And your job is also to help find solutions and bring particularly women's voices and using women journalists as well. But one group that faces a lot of threat, that faces sexual violations, that faces civilian protection issues are a number of women's groups as well. So how do you do your work in a way that protects, that puts a spotlight on women journalists? How do you protect them? How are they able to get across the various front lines to do precisely the work that Ben was talking about?
Exactement. Je vais aller en français. Tout d'abord,
if you'll allow me, I'll speak English. So thank you very much, first of all, for touching upon the topic and for connecting all the questions that are related to journalism, and also the difference between international journalism and local journalism, those who are working in conflict zones. I'd like to start by sharing with you my personal comments on what was said during the roundtable discussion. It's exactly what was said by my colleagues. Local journalists have no insurance, have no means of being protected. They are badly paid. I mean, they're paid 1/3 or 1/2 of what international journalists are. This is the case of journalists in conflict zones, whether they be men or women. Now, if we go further and talk about women and on women journalists working in conflict areas, well, we are present in countries in which women and children are the first victims of armed conflicts and of geopolitical problems of all kinds. When women decide to speak up and to become journalists, it's already incredibly brave, incredibly courageous, and they are confronted responded to twice as many problems as their male colleagues are. Why? Well, this is related to gender issues, just because they're women and they're faced with difficulties that are due to their society, sometimes to their family, faced with armed groups, and therefore faced with all of the consequences of a war that can destroy society. So women journalists in conflict areas are not necessarily interested in going to the front line. We have one or two in Syria. We had a few of them who wanted to go to the front line, but their media gave that responsibility to male journalists to go to the front line. But at the same time, women in conflict areas are more interested in understanding what happens after war, after bombings, because women are interested in what is related to daily lives, the rights of children, the rights of women, and in covering and informing the world on the devastating effects of war. Because women, are not in decision-making positions. So when women journalists decide to cover conflict zones, they decide to go to and cover theaters and subject matters that are not necessarily the local media or the international media. So our association is presented today as a solution at the Paris Peace Forum that works with women journalists, artists, activists who want to change society. These women come from different countries. And the solution we call journalism for human rights is something we have decided upon because human rights are so important. When we speak up and we say grab a microphone and speak out, we women can start taking our own place in society. So I think what is important is that women hold their own right place in society and have platforms that they can manage themselves in countries such as Iraq, Yemen, Syria, and in countries in which women are second-tier citizens, the media structures are managed by men.
Let me just ask.
Can I carry on? Oh, sorry, I'm going to introduce.
Let me ask you a question about the various countries that you specified. If you can, for benefit of our audience, what have you seen sort of at the core challenge, and are there any positive outcomes that you've seen based on the work that the organization is doing? I mean, you mentioned Iran and Yemen, and it would be just interesting for the purpose of our audience to get a sense of how you define the challenges, but also what you see as the opportunities in the training that you've done, in the work and the effort that you've done to try and get women to focus both on the conflict, but also on the human rights dimension that you're talking about.
Tout à fait. Alors, nous, on a trois actions principales.
We have three main actions. Education, we work on creating space for women through education, and we have theoretical teaching on management, on techniques, on the possibility of physical protection against cyber attacks, and creation of independent platforms. So in this first action, we have created two podcast platforms, and we have created 150 podcasts, and we have created 35 podcast women producers, and we have a platform which is called mechanic.net, and which is managed by women from A to Z, but which is intended for everybody. Then the second action is the question of protection, and third action is networking. So for the protection, we are working on big areas. We are based in Yemen and Iraq, and we produce podcasts. But for the protection and network, we are working on 12 countries of the Middle East and Northern Africa, Iran and Afghanistan being included in this network. So we have created a protection network, which is a securized space for women, so that women can share their difficulties, their need, and be able to talk to one another.
We'll come back and ask you some more questions, Shada, but this is helpful because I should let all of you know that Shada's organization is here and has a special booth here where we can also look clearly at the work that countless women in these countries are focused on. But I'll come back to you again, Shada. I want to turn to Alexander, because Alexander is not a journalist, but she's a human rights lawyer. And one of the sort of the big challenges that we're seeing, Alexander, is that in a sense, this is the age of impunity, where people can get away with literally anything. There are no more guardrails. And as a human rights lawyer, how relevant is journalism to the work that you're doing? Because I think it was Ben or Netta who talked about the importance of documentation, importance of making sure that we have the right information, the importance of being able to verify information as well. And as a human rights lawyer, how do you see the role of journalists as being maybe one of the tools, one of the bodies, one of the institutions that are critical to being able to document in an age of impunity where you're trying to hold perpetrators accountable for the crimes that they committed? And you're coming from Ukraine, and you'll have a lot of interesting narratives to also provide in your own assessment. Thank you.
Let me remind that journalists were the first people who came to the crime of the scene when Russia shot Malaysia Boeing and killed approximately 300 people in 2014. Journalists were the first people who collect first evidence, and years later this evidence were presented in a court in The Hague, which return hope for justice for families. And journalists in different wars and conflict zones see something which others don't want them to see, and that's why journalism is one of the most dangerous professions in the world. But journalism is also one of the most important professions in the world, because first, which is being killed in the war, it's truth. And let me share with you my personal story. I was in Kiev when Russian troops tried to circle it. I refused to evacuate, and with part of my team, we continued the work of documentation. And when Ukrainian army withdrawn Russian troops from Bucha, from Vorzel, from Otyzhen, from Irpin, we sent mobiles group to work there. Prior to this, European countries imposed sanctions against Russia, and they cut from the SWIFT 3 or 4 banks, and that's all. And I was shocked, because I told to myself, Russia started large-scale war, millions of people are suffering, and you just sanctioned 3 or 4 Russian banks, and that's all? So when we came to Bucha, we found dead bodies of civilians who lay scattered around the streets until liberation. We found dead bodies of civilians in the gardens of their own households. We found dead bodies of civilians, men and women, with their hands tied under their back in the mass graves. We found dead bodies of civilians, the whole family with children, in the cars, in civilians' cars, which were shooting while they tried to escape from the danger zone. Alongside with us, it were different journalists from different countries, and they also found these dead bodies. And they made articles, they made photos, they made videos. And when this information appeared in the world, suddenly the change happened, because ordinary people were so shocked. They told, we don't care about political issues, it's a horror. And they start to urge the government to stop it. And Western governments start to send weapons for Ukraine to be able to defend ourselves. And they started to impose real sanctions to freeze the ability of Russian economy to feed this war. So may I use this podium to say thank you to say thank you for journalists who was with us during these years. We survived because of you. Because the access to truthful information is very important, because how people see the world define what people think, what people say, what people do. They define decisions. And may I say thank you for journalists who still continue this work in Ukraine and in other conflict zones, because I always tell to myself, if Russians commit this horror in Bucha when the whole world was watching, what the hell is waiting of us if you stop writing? And I would like to finish on one important issue that probably not all people in this audience know, that 29 Ukrainian journalists are in Russian captivity. And I would like to highlight this number. 29 Ukrainian journalists are in Russian captivity. And just recently, one of them, my colleague, whom I know personally, 27-year-old journalist Victoria Roshina, was dead. She was dead in Russian prison, and we don't know why. We have no idea what Russians did with her, because Russians refused to return her body to her family. And I have a question as a human rights lawyer. If we can't even push Russia to return the body of that journalist to her parents, what we can do? And I ask UN to create a special commission and investigate what happened with our colleague and friend Victoria Roshina.
Alexander, thank you for what you've just said, because I think this is the heart of the matter, as you have rightly spotlighted as well, and I appreciate the candor and also the tribute that you wanted to pay to journalists as well. The numbers are pretty stark. I wanted to ask you, because we're talking a lot about print media, online sort of TV filmmakers like Ben, like Shader as well. But I wanted to talk about the other forms of media, especially social media platforms as well. And in Ukraine, for example, the role of Telegraph and other online media. I mean, Ben said at one level it's empowering that people have access to X, to Instagram, to TikTok, and can create their own news. But as a human rights lawyer, what does it mean when you're confronted with these various social media platforms? How can we, to use your phrase, you said what is being killed is the truth, but how are you able to weave through the multitude of information that comes through these platforms to get at the truth in the way that you are talking about, and how do you use it then in the effort to document the truth in your work?
I know that people start to understand that the war is going on only when the bombs fall on their heads. But war has not just military dimension. War has economic dimension, digital dimension, informational dimension, and value dimension. And unfortunately, social network become a platform for informational war. Because according to the algorithm of big techs, lies spread several times quicker than truth. Mm-hmm. And emotional lies spread even quicker. So we have to do something with it, because before it needs time to create some fake and to distribute it, but now, because of rapid development of new technologies, every people from this audience can pay just $50 and have access to it to create fake video or fake photo or fake audio, which completely changed the perception of information from social network. and which make the work of professional journalists is even more and more crucial.
Yeah. And in fact, before I go to the audience, I'm asking you to prepare your questions that you may want to ask. Just on this last point, Alexander, I think it's a good way to go back to Ben. How do you maintain standards, high standards, Ben? Just when you hear what Alexander just said, and you said that it was an empowering tool, but it's a double-edged sword, right? So you empower people, but then how do you then safeguard the high standards of journalism so that the truth, the ground truth, as Alexander outlined, is preserved, is protected, and can stand up, and be used effectively for the likes of Annetta to do her work, but in front of the United Nations and in front of the international public opinion? How do you maintain that high standards of verification throughout your work?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely don't want the reputation of somebody to say, social media is so good for war. It is not. It is complicated. The best thing that we can do as professional journalists is try to teach local journalists, audiences, how to decipher these things. Most important work that I do, especially in this stage of my career after doing it for so long, is not the groundwork. It is mentorship of local journalists, teaching people that I work with how best to decipher, disseminate, and then communicate information that they receive. Ukraine is the most important example. In Ukraine, I work with a local journalist there named Julia Kochtova, who is a photographer, but also an amazing journalist and documentary filmmaker. Julia is the perfect example of somebody who has, for so long, worked as a Ukrainian on getting her story out, getting the story of Ukraine out. It's only in the past 3 years since the war started that the fake news is becoming her main battle. And being able to work with her and use her experience and her language and her ability to see these things and to spot things that are fake and to spot things that are real is so important in the way that we utilize social media, found footage, archival footage that we want to use to tell better stories. The most important reporting I'm seeing these days on all of these conflicts is analysis, is forensic evidence that we as journalists can take online and verify. Teaching people how to do that, teaching people how to utilize those skills is the most important effort that we can do right now in spreading the ability to push back fake news.
Yeah, and that's an important point. And Shade, your organization, I know, is concerned about that. Peter, I can only imagine that the reason why you wanted this panel was to also make sure that we are better protecting the work of journalists, but also doing the kind of mentoring, the kind of training, the kind of fact verification that I think is important to guarantee the work of journalism as well. Shade, I'm going to come back to you, but I want to make sure there's nobody in the audience who wants to ask any questions to any of you. Please, the gentleman in the front here. And if there are any other people who want to ask questions, let me know and I'll come back to the panel.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yes? Okay. Daniel Brown, I'm a journalist and I've mainly had a career at Radio France International. I wanted to talk about another Daniel Pearl, who was assassinated, a friend of mine 22 years ago. Wall Street Journal did a heroic job trying to maintain pressure to find out the truth behind that. And I wanted to mention that because of the longevity of journalists being targeted. But there are two elephants in the room that I think haven't been addressed yet by the panel. And the first one is who owns the media? More and more, it's private business leaders with their own agenda, putting more and more pressure on journalists and on independent journalism, as I'm sure you're well aware. And the second is states that some would call rogue in terms of killing journalists. Saudi Arabia, for example, and the assassination of Khashoggi, and especially since October the 7th, Israel. But also before, having killed Shimon Abu Akleh, an American citizen in the West Bank. So my question is the responsibility and the role of the international community to put pressure on governments, because they're the only ones able to somehow stop this onslaught, both on social media and on mainstream traditional media, such as the Wall Street Journal, and how that's being addressed, because that's the most urgent thing, to answer some of the preoccupations that Alexandra was mentioning.
Daniel, this is an excellent question, and I'll turn to the panel. Shade, I'm going to turn to you first as well, because I think this is the heart of the matter as well. Essentially, increasing military censorship, but also who owns the media matters in terms of how you can provide accurate information as well. Please.
Actually, en fait, on a un focus particulier.
In fact, we are focusing on women because we think that thanks to women, we are going nearer stabilization and peace. And today, there are 20-odd women from 12 countries who are here. They participate in this forum, and they are witnesses from the country. They come from Tunis, from Iraq, from 12 countries. You can go and talk to this woman face to face to understand what's at stake, because they don't work only on women's issues. They also work on human rights, and they work on how journalists, like in Ukraine, work. We were lucky enough to have journalists who covering Ukraine, but there are countries where there are no coverage. In Syria, you've got children who die every day. You've got journalists who are taken hostage, and nobody knows. And the international media and the international policy go from country to country. We don't talk about Ukraine any longer. Now we talk about another country. So, I mean, the news, changes, and we completely forget about what's going on to the previous one. So do go and talk to them, because they can witness, they can show what they've seen and what they've went through, and it is very interesting.
We've got sort of 4 minutes left, and Alexander, I know you wanted to react to that, and I'd really like to get your view, Annette, because I think Daniel put an important message on the table, and you as well, Ben. Please, Alexander.
I think that support for independent journalism is crucial. I personally subscribe to programs, and every month I donate to 5 independent Ukrainian media. Can people who donate at least to 1 media per month raise your hand in this audience? I think this is the first step which we have to start to do. We have to start to pay for truth. We have to start to pay for objective information. We have to start to change this spiral of finance of media, because we need truth. And without resources, the journalist can't work either on peaceful time nor in conflict zones.
This is a very, very powerful message you just provided, Alexander. Annette, please.
Thank you. And I think, if we're looking, and Comfort, you said it, it's an era of impunity, and I think this really goes not just to the question, what is an independent media, but also the question, is there one truth? Because, these narratives are reflecting an idea of truth that is becoming more and more disconnected from what is really happening on the ground. It's becoming, news becomes more what people want it to become rather than what is happening. So how do you come back to really find the facts on the ground if there is no access? So, putting pressure as the international community, Daniel, absolutely. But how do you put pressure if there is basically no access for humanitarian workers, for journalists, if the work for journalists in Sudan right now is so difficult, but also so dangerous that if you walk into Darfur, there is no guarantee for a journalist to be protected, and we see it every day. So how do you contextualize what the bits and pieces you find? How do you contextualize, the news? How do you do the fact check in this era of impunity, in this era of fake news? And I think this is really a much bigger question. And yes, financing is crucial. But I think it's also a bigger question in terms of, are we using the pressure enough, also in terms of protection of journalism, independent journalism? What does independent journalism mean for many of these leaders? they have no interest for independent journalists to cover an independent side of the story. So it's intrinsic in the warfare to not allow. And I think these are pressure points as international community we need to speak out louder. But are we getting to a full-fledged understanding of the truth in plural? And if their facts are, if they're not based on facts, I think is becoming increasingly a problem. And I just, would like to allude to the tweet of Elon Musk yesterday or last week is like, you are now the news. So basically, whatever comes to your mind is becoming the news. And I think this is really. That's so problematic on so many levels, and it will be affecting all of us in war zones and outside.
Ben, let me give you the last word. Thank you.
I think that, again, in looking at the few positives that we have in the media industry at this moment, the rise of independent journalism, I think, is one of the most important things that I, as somebody that works for a big media organization, is seeing. There are so many journalists that are not getting paid, that don't have financing. It's not because we don't want to do the work. It's not because we're not able or experienced enough. It's because the money is drying up, because these things are harder to come by. The best hope that I have for the media industry at this point is seeing independent, especially local independent journalists, especially women local independent journalists, take to the internet in more interesting and powerful ways to have the financing to do the work. Patreon, Substack, these things that we're just starting to see as financing opportunities are becoming ways that, like, you don't have to subscribe to this news outlet anymore. You can subscribe to this journalist. So as Alexandra said, like, paying for this journalism, paying for the journalists that you see on these independent media sites, on these things where they're maybe not asking for money, but asking for subscriptions, is the way for these journalists to do the work independently and hopefully develop new ways to be able to tell stories outside of the big, simple, old ways. These old ways are not sustainable anymore. Yeah. These big media industries, we don't have the financing, we don't have the support, and we don't have the viewership and the readership to go and do the work we need to do. The few lucky enough, me included in there, the few privileged enough, I'm an American, I'm white, I'm a man, like, it's these privileges that allow me to do it, but really, like, the things that we need to be able to see is these financing things open up in new and important ways, and hopefully we'll start to see that over the next few years.
I really want to thank all four of you, because every utterance that you made had a solution. You were very specific in what the way forward is, and this is a really important note to end on, that the support that we can also give to individual journalists, but also making very clear the essence of maintaining the standards, the high standards that are necessary for journalists, but also the human story that all of you provided in your different ways. I really want to thank all four of you for the great work that you do, particularly on the front line, but also putting a really clear spotlight on journalism, but also just what it means to protect news and to protect truth on the ground. Thank you very much to our four panelists.